After 4 years together, my fiancé said, "You're not worthy of being my wife. I'll find someone better," and left me. I just laughed. Now his new girlfriend has married someone else, and he's begging me to come back. But his messages are read by my new husband. I trusted my best friend with every detail of my marriage problems. I cried to her, slept on her couch, and believed she was the only one on my side until I accidentally read a message that proved she had been secretly coaching my husband for months on how to manipulate me, gaslight my reality, drain me emotionally, and walk away looking like the victim while I was falling apart. They had no idea I was about to make them regret everything. I never thought betrayal would arrive dressed as concern, whispered advice, and late-night phone calls meant to support me, and for a long time I believed I was lucky to have a best friend like Claire. Someone who listened patiently while I spoke about the distance growing between my husband and me, someone who nodded sympathetically, held my hand, and told me everything I wanted to hear, all while quietly positioning herself closer and closer to the center of my life, into spaces she never truly belonged, until the day I realized that the help I had been accepting so gratefully was never meant to save my marriage, but to dismantle it piece by piece from the inside. My husband, Lucas, had changed slowly, subtly, in ways easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention, his patience thinning, his affection becoming mechanical, his eyes drifting away during conversations as if rehearsing responses rather than listening. And every time I brought it up, Claire was there, soothing, reassuring, telling me I was overthinking, that men went through phases, that I needed to be more understanding, more flexible, more quiet, advice that always somehow left me questioning myself rather than his behavior, and I trusted her because she had been there for years, because she knew my fears, my insecurities, my weaknesses, things I had never even fully admitted to myself. What I didn't realize was that while I was confiding in her, pouring out my doubts and pain, she was collecting information, organizing it, refining it, turning my vulnerability into a blueprint. And Lucas began repeating phrases I had never heard from him before, sentences that sounded rehearsed, carefully structured, strangely familiar, until one evening it hit me with terrifying clarity that I had heard those exact words somewhere else, spoken in the same tone, with the same emphasis coming from Claire's mouth during one of our supportive conversations, and the realization sent a chill through me that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. I started noticing the timing, the way Lucas would suddenly become distant after long phone calls with Claire, the way she always seemed to know details about our private arguments before I ever mentioned them, the way she encouraged space while quietly inserting herself deeper into both our lives, and the more I observed, the clearer it became that nothing about this was accidental, that the growing cracks in my marriage were being carefully guided, nurtured, expanded by someone who smiled at me and told me she only wanted the best for me. The moment that changed everything came unexpectedly, quietly, without drama, when I borrowed Lucas's tablet to look up a recipe and a message notification appeared on the screen, not hidden, not locked, as if fate itself wanted me to see it. And there it was, a conversation thread filled with late-night messages, strategic advice, carefully worded scripts on how to respond to me, how to avoid accountability, how to make me doubt my own instincts, and as I scrolled, heart pounding, breath shallow, I realized that Claire wasn't just comforting me while my marriage crumbled, she was actively instructing my husband on how to lie, how to manipulate, and how to slowly detach from me without ever looking like the villain. I didn't confront either of them. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I closed the tablet, placed it back exactly where I found it, and smiled when Lucas walked into the room, because in that moment I understood something that would change everything. I wasn't losing control of my life. I was finally gaining clarity. And clarity is far more dangerous to manipulators than anger ever could be. From that moment on, I stopped being the confused wife and became the quiet observer, the one who listens without reacting, who watches without revealing, who plans without rushing, because the people who think they are controlling the narrative often forget one thing. The person they underestimate is usually the one writing the ending, and I had just discovered exactly who my enemies were, how close they were, and how deeply they had underestimated me. The truth started leaking back to me in fragments, not through dramatic confessions or public meltdowns, but through quiet overlaps, mutual acquaintances who didn't realize how much weight their casual comments carried, mentions of arguments, of tension, of expectations that suddenly felt heavier now that there was no one left to absorb his frustrations without pushing back, and I listened without reacting, because every small detail confirmed what I had already sensed, that the woman he left me for wasn't an upgrade, she was a mirror, and he didn't like what she reflected back at him. He wanted admiration without accountability, loyalty without emotional depth, and the moment she began questioning him, challenging the narratives he fed her, the fantasy cracked. Because he wasn't prepared to maintain the image he sold when real intimacy demanded consistency rather than charm, and slowly, the confident man who walked out of my life started shrinking into someone constantly explaining himself, justifying his choices, defending a relationship that no longer felt effortless. I stayed silent, not out of fear, but out of detachment, because there is a strange power that comes when you no longer need closure from someone who already revealed their limits, and while he was busy convincing the world that he had one, I was quietly winning my own battles, setting boundaries, pursuing opportunities one had postponed, surrounding myself with people who didn't require me to prove my worth in exchange for basic respect. Then, unexpectedly, his name reappeared on my phone, not boldly, not directly, but disguised as concern, a simple message asking how I was doing, as if he hadn't dismantled my life with calculated cruelty months earlier. And I stared at the screen for a long moment, recognizing the shift immediately, because men who are truly happy don't check on the women they once discarded. I replied politely, briefly, giving him nothing he could latch onto, and that restraint unsettled him more than anger ever could, because when someone no longer reacts, they are no longer controllable, and within days, his messages multiplied. Growing longer, warmer, nostalgic, subtly rewriting our past into something he suddenly missed, emphasizing the stability, the understanding, the support he once took for granted but now felt absent from his carefully curated new reality. What he didn't know was that while he was trying to reopen a door he had slammed shut, my life was already expanding in directions he couldn't access anymore, and the confidence I carried now wasn't performative, it was rooted. Shaped by survival rather than validation, and every message he sent only confirmed that the version of me he deemed unworthy had outgrown the version of him that needed control to feel significant. The irony wasn't lost on me, watching him circle back with uncertainty creeping into his words, testing the waters, searching for reassurance he once denied me. Because the moment someone realizes they miscalculated your value is the moment their regret begins, quietly at first, then desperately, and I knew, without responding further, that this wasn't the end of his return. It was only the beginning of his unraveling. And, while he believed he still had influence, that a few well-crafted messages could undo the damage he caused, I had already moved beyond the need to explain myself to someone who failed to recognize my worth when it was offered freely, unaware that the next phase of my life would make his regret painfully irreversible. The shift became undeniable the moment his messages stopped pretending to be casual and started carrying urgency. Not desperation yet, but something close, a tightening between the lines where confidence once lived. Because reality had begun correcting the story, he told himself when he walked away, and it wasn't kind to him. I learned, again not from him directly, but from the quiet ripple of shared spaces and whispered truths, that his new relationship had collapsed suddenly and publicly, not with closure or maturity, but with confusion and embarrassment. Because the woman he chased after me didn't stay long enough to be molded into his expectations. She chose differently, married someone else, someone who didn't require her to compete with ghosts or earn affection through submission, and that loss hit him harder than he expected, because it wasn't just about her, it was about what her departure symbolized. He had convinced himself that leaving me was proof of his value, that he could discard commitment and immediately be rewarded with something better, but when the reward vanished, when the illusion shattered in front of people who had watched him boast about his choices, the regret didn't just hurt privately, it humiliated him, and that humiliation needed somewhere to go. That's when the messages changed tone completely, no longer polite check-ins or nostalgic reflections, but apologies disguised as insight, paragraphs analyzing his mistakes, claiming growth, acknowledging my strength as if it were a recent discovery rather than something he dismissed for years, and I read every word with calm detachment, because when someone only recognizes your worth after losing access to you, it's not love, it's loss of control. He started referencing our past with revisionist tenderness, emphasizing moments where I supported him, stood by him, believed in him when others doubted him, subtly reminding me of the emotional labor I once provided freely. Hoping memory would do the convincing his ego no longer could, but what he didn't understand was that memory without presence has no power, and nostalgia can't compete with peace. I didn't argue, didn't defend myself, didn't reopen old wounds, because silence became my boundary, and every unanswered message forced him to confront the version of himself he avoided, the one who walked away from loyalty-chasing validation, only to realize too late that stability doesn't wait around forever. What he couldn't see yet was that my life had crossed a threshold he no longer belonged to, not dramatically, not publicly, but decisively, and while he was trying to reclaim a past that no longer existed, I was standing firmly in a present built without him, surrounded by clarity instead of chaos, intention instead of excuses. The more he reached out, the clearer it became that this wasn't about reconciliation, it was about reassurance, about wanting proof that he still mattered somewhere, that he hadn't misjudged everything, and that realization settled heavily in me. Because I finally understood that closure doesn't come from conversations, it comes from no longer needing one. And as his messages continued, growing more frequent, more emotional, more revealing, I knew the next time he reached out wouldn't be to reminisce or apologize, it would be to ask for something he believed I would always give, unaware that the woman he left behind no longer existed. The moment he finally asked to see me, everything clicked, not because I felt tempted or nostalgic, but because I recognized the pattern so clearly it almost felt rehearsed, the sudden urgency, the insistence that a real conversation was needed. The claim that texting couldn't capture what he truly wanted to say, as if proximity alone could resurrect the power he once held, but that power had already expired. He framed it as closure, as mutual healing, as two mature adults tying loose ends, yet beneath the carefully chosen words was something far more familiar, a need to look into my eyes and confirm whether I was still accessible, still emotionally reachable. Still someone he could influence if he pushed the right buttons, and that realization stripped the request of any innocence it pretended to carry. I didn't agree immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity, because time has a way of revealing intention, and his persistence did all the explaining for me, message after message layered with regret, flattery, and subtle guilt, reminding me how special what we had was, how rare our connection had been, how difficult it was for him to move on, conveniently omitting how easy it was for him to leave. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly account for, was that every message he sent didn't reach me directly, not really, because my life was no longer compartmentalized the way it used to be. There were no hidden threads, no emotional secrecy. No lonely nights waiting for validation. There was transparency now, stability, someone who didn't flinch at honesty or disappear when things required effort. The first time my husband saw one of his messages, he didn't react with anger or jealousy. He simply looked at me, calm and grounded, and asked if I was okay, and that single question carried more respect than years of conditional affection ever had. Because love that doesn't threaten or interrogate is the kind that doesn't need competition. We decided together, quietly and without drama, that the messages wouldn't be blocked, not yet, not out of curiosity or spite, but because there was value in witnessing the unraveling. In watching someone confront the consequences of their own choices without interference, and every unread notification became a reminder of how far I had come. His tone shifted again when responses never came, from hopeful to anxious, from confident to unsettled, as if the absence of my voice forced him to face a truth he had avoided, that I wasn't punishing him, I wasn't strategizing. I simply wasn't available anymore, emotionally or otherwise, and that realization hit harder than any argument ever could. Then one evening, he sent a message that crossed a line, not cruel, not threatening, but revealing, asking if I was truly happy, if I had rushed into something new, if maybe I was settling just to prove a point. And that was when I understood that he wasn't afraid of losing me, he was afraid that I had won. Because happiness without him wasn't supposed to be possible in his version of the story, and the fact that it existed, quietly and undeniably, meant he could no longer position himself as the standard by which my life was measured. And as his questions grew more personal, more intrusive, more desperate, I realized the next step wouldn't be a request or an apology, it would be a confrontation he wasn't prepared for, one that would expose just how much control he had truly lost. The confrontation didn't happen in public, didn't happen with shouting or drama. It happened in the quiet of a message thread that I allowed to exist only because I knew exactly what I wanted. And every word he typed revealed more about the man he truly was than any conversation we had shared in those 4 years. A man who could leave without hesitation, who could discard loyalty with a shrug, yet who suddenly seemed fragile. Desperate to prove to himself that he still mattered somewhere. He tried every tactic he had used before, flattery, guilt, nostalgia, subtle threats of loss, but they bounced off me now, not because I was cold, but because I had rebuilt the boundaries he had once dismantled. Because every effort he made to manipulate or control me now only reinforced my understanding that I had outgrown him emotionally long before he realized it, and that power shift, invisible to him, was intoxicating. Then came the real test. The messages that mentioned my new husband, not in anger, not in threat, but in incredulity, disbelief that someone else could occupy the space he once claimed. And I could almost feel his mind struggling to reconcile the image of a life he abandoned with the reality he could no longer influence, and I smiled quietly to myself, because finally, the tables had turned in a way that words could never fully express. Every red receipt that appeared on his messages was a tiny victory, invisible yet monumental, because my new husband knew everything, had witnessed the attempts, and allowed them to continue only to let natural consequences unfold. And the awareness that the man who had once tried to diminish me now had no control over how his words were received was more satisfying than any dramatic confrontation could have been. I didn't need to write back, didn't need to explain, didn't need to justify myself, because silence in the right hands is more devastating than 1,000 angry replies, and I watched as his tone shifted once again, this time from disbelief to panic. Subtle but unmistakable, a desperation creeping in around the edges of his carefully constructed bravado, and I realized that the power of a person who has chosen their own life cannot be measured until someone who tried to destroy it recognizes. They can no longer intervene. And just as I began to feel the quiet satisfaction of detachment, a new layer appeared, the implication that he still thought he could influence me somehow, that perhaps with enough charm or persistence, he could rewrite my happiness. And that's when I made the decision fully. This story, this chapter, was mine to close on my terms, and the only thing left to do was to watch him unravel as the consequences of his choices fully revealed themselves, without ever needing to interfere, without ever giving him the satisfaction of control again. By this point, the messages had taken on a desperate edge, a tone that betrayed the man who had once walked away so confidently, the man who had believed that abandoning me would be effortless and consequence-free, now realizing that every word he had typed, Every decision he had made had finally met the resistance he had never anticipated, and it was intoxicating to witness from a distance, calm, collected, untouchable. He began sending long paragraphs, each one more revealing than the last, filled with self-justification, twisted nostalgia, and attempts to remind me of my supposed mistakes in leaving him. As if he could turn the narrative in his favor now that the stability he had taken for granted was gone. But I read every single word quietly, smiling to myself, because his own insecurities were now on full display, raw and unfiltered. And no amount of charm could mask the truth of what he had lost. What I realized in those moments was that my silence was more powerful than any argument I could have staged, more devastating than any public confrontation, because it forced him to reckon with the reality that the woman he had dismissed, mocked, and abandoned had not only moved on, but had done so in a way that rendered his interference irrelevant, and that truth was a weight he could not escape. And then came the admission hidden between his words, subtle but undeniable, that he was watching, obsessing, measuring every aspect of my life, not to reconnect, not to apologize, but to assess whether the life he had discarded had been ruined, whether my happiness was diminished, whether the consequences of his choices had somehow still allowed him to feel powerful. And that was when I allowed myself the smallest, quiet laugh, because he was discovering the ultimate irony. I was thriving, and nothing he could do could change it. I forwarded a few of the most revealing messages to my husband, who read them with calm patience, never once intervening or reacting in anger, simply acknowledging them and letting the truth of his desperation speak for itself. And I knew then that this was a lesson that didn't need to be taught by confrontation, but by observation, and that watching him unravel while I remained untouchable was a form of justice far sweeter than any dramatic retaliation. From that day forward, his messages continued, but with diminishing confidence, each one exposing more about him than about me. Every line a testament to how wrong he had been, and I savored the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he could not manipulate, could not threaten, could not disrupt the life I had rebuilt without him, and that my laughter, my peace, and my strength were victories he could not reclaim. And as I read the latest desperate attempts, I realized that the final act of this story wouldn't require confrontation, revenge, or spectacle. It would simply be my continued happiness, my unwavering life. And the knowledge that the man who once dismissed me was now left only with the consequences of his own choices, fully visible for all his bravado to see. By the time his messages had slowed to a desperate trickle, I had already moved beyond needing to respond, beyond needing to explain, beyond needing to justify my existence to someone who had once deemed it unworthy. And every word he sent afterward was nothing more than a mirror reflecting his own failures, his own impatience, his own inability to recognize what he had lost until it was untouchable. Then came the most unexpected moment. He sent a message begging, not with anger, not with charm, not with flattery, but with raw, almost humbling honesty, admitting mistakes, confessing regret, trying to appeal to emotions he had ignored for years. And yet, even in that vulnerability, it was clear he didn't understand the most important lesson, that remorse does not automatically restore what was taken, that apology cannot undo manipulation, and that some doors, once closed, remain firmly shut. My husband, calm as ever, watched the messages silently with me, a silent partner in the unspoken plan that I had been living my life fully, unapologetically, and every single message from my ex was read, not ignored, but observed. A testament to the power of transparency, because nothing infuriates a manipulator more than realizing that the control they once had is gone forever, and that attempts to reclaim it will be witnessed without fear or reaction. When the final message arrived, pleading, desperate, hinting at reconciliation, promising he had changed, promising he would never hurt me again, I didn't reply, and I didn't need to, because the weight of my new life, the love and respect I shared with someone who truly valued me, spoke louder than any words I could type, and I understood fully that silence, when combined with strength and peace, is the most devastating reply a person like him can ever receive. And in that moment, as I watched the read receipt glow under the words that once carried power over me, I realized that this was my ultimate victory, my final act of justice. I had endured, I had rebuilt, I had laughed when it mattered most. And the man who once abandoned me now lived under the quiet torment of his own regret, helpless to change a reality I had created without him, stronger and happier than he could ever imagine. The irony was perfect, the satisfaction absolute, and I finally allowed myself to smile fully, because revenge had not been my goal, control had not been my aim, only survival, growth, and happiness, and in the end, those were victories that no amount of regret, no flood of messages, and no pleading could ever take away. The man who once claimed I wasn't worthy now understood too late that I always was, and that the life I built beyond his abandonment was untouchable, unstoppable, and utterly mine.